The original plan for today's video was to talk about Team Liquid and Dragon because, frankly, there are some things that are interesting, there are some things that are misconceptions, there are things that they're doing well, there are things that they're doing bad, but that is not what I decided to do because I realized that over the past 3 days there has been something even more important and something even more interesting happening that really has to be addressed. What is this super duper important thing? Please lower your volume. Please, protect the ears of any children. LPL hasn't lost a fucking game! Pardon my French, but that is extremely significant, and we'll get into exactly why that is, but as we cover that line of reasoning and that line of thought, we come to the inevitable conclusion that there's really no excuse or no reason as to why that Europe and North America, or frankly many other regions, can't really replicate that level of success. But that, my friends, is the conclusion of today's video, so let's instead start at the opening of the rabbit hole, the entrance, if you will. For those of you who are familiar with the LPL's history, way back down at time 2011, you had one of your first ever League of Legends domestic tournaments. You had the LPL appearing at the World Cyber Games. You had various events occurring such that LPL sort of begins to pick up steam. They had their own server, and even though they weren't invited to Worlds, they were very much a presence. But at that time, there was a very sort of lawless environment that occurred within the LPL, and the kind of emerging team at the very beginning was Catastrophic Cool Memory. You had someone like Whites and Tabe who were sort of monitoring and keeping leadership. There were internal conflicts and everything else, but it definitely set the tone for the idea that the LPL is very much sort of a player-led environment. You had teams emerging from that, such as Invictus Gaming, ex-Catastrophic Cool Memory, and Team WE, which became more dominant forces, again, sort of player run. Invictus Gaming, famously, even though they had a very large, very wealthy backer in the son of the richest man in China, were absolutely a team that was kind of a rich man's plaything. He sort of hired his gamer friends, you know, in a way. He hired gamers to play the game with him. To this day, he still duos with players like Rookie, players like Jackie Love, players like Battleland a lot. This kind of interferes with practice sometimes, but obviously not as big of a factor as it was then. The only reason I'm bringing this up is that very much the LPL was player-led. If you were a very good player and had a very strong leadership personality, then probably your team would succeed, and this ended up being the determining factor for a lot of famous rosters, as with Team WE, with Wei Xiao, as with OMG, with players like Cool to an extent, and obviously this was a team that was very much plagued by the idea that they were a family, that they were constantly a feuding family, and there were all sorts of issues coming out of that. You also had, coming out of this era, you had Clearlove and Edward Gaming becoming a very dominant force. And then, of course, I feel like, to an extent, Mata, even though he wasn't a Chinese player, could have the same kind of reputation. And then now, I think that UZI has sort of evolved to that person, and he isn't necessarily the one calling everything. He still has very much a presence, and he can sort of dictate the environment. All of this contributed to the identity of the LPL to an extent, being a region that was very much about team fighting, very much about individual outplays and just raw talent in general, and people coming to a 5v5, people going to bot lane and fighting, even though their power spikes might not necessarily align. There isn't enough wave control, with the exception of Team WE, which obviously has been credited with kind of the idea of the slow push, or changing the amount of minions on one side so that they're pushing very slowly to the other, the as you will, the sixth man, very famous from Clement Chu's article at the time. Other than Team WE, the reputation of the LPL for a very long time has been that, you know, they have some good players here and there, but they don't always end up on the same teams, and they're really unorganized, so they can take games off of the very best teams in the world, but they can also lose games to the very worst. Ever since I sort of started covering the LPL in 2013, 2014, I've been fighting somewhat of an uphill battle in the sense that I don't necessarily think that perfectly describes the region, but there was always a grain of truth to it, or otherwise it wouldn't exist. But that is really the big crux of why it's so impressive that the LPL are undefeated. Obviously, your instant response is going to be that it's been a very easy start for the LPL. You had Edward Gaming face his Mad Team, the worst team arguably in their group. You had in Group B, RNG starting out against Cloud9, also arguably the worst team in their group. You had Invictus Gaming starting out against DRX, also arguably the worst team in their group. But as time progressed, after a couple of days, we also have Invictus Gaming taking out Fnatic, probably the best team in their group. You have RNG taking out Gen G, the team that was most intimidating to look at. And you really only have Edward Gaming left that is trying to look at the best team in their group before you can talk about LPL's undefeatedness being really, really impressive. I think, frankly, it doesn't really matter which teams. The fact that Edward Gaming isn't dropping games to HQ, the fact that you don't have this level of polarity already speaks to how far the LPL region has come from this extremely teamfight oriented 1v1 outplay region, and why the fact that in the most recent years RNG has sort of led the charge and the development of the region. What I'm really afraid of at this point is that people in the West will kind of retcon LPL's development to an extent. They will say things like, well, LPL and LCK have always been a step above the West, that it's always sort of been East versus West. Flash Wolf's a great example of this, fall into that category. There's nothing really that impressive. There's no growth here. But if you remember what happened in 2015, between 2014 and 2015, with the massive exodus of ex-Samsung players going over to China, I think it's really, really crucial to understand exactly the growth and the development that China and the LPL region has made. In 2013 and 2014, you had the highest placement by an LPL team at the World Championship in the history pretty much ever. You know, you have UZI and Royal getting to the final. Starhorn Royal Club Huangzhou. Both two different names, same organizations, getting to the grand final against the dominant Korean team who eventually won. At the close of 2014, because Starhorn Royal Club was the team that had imported INSEC, they had imported Zero, there was a wave of fervor throughout the region that, you know, the reason why Chinese teams are not winning worlds is because the players are not good enough. That was obviously only part of what happened, because I think that the streaming companies and the streaming sponsorship had a major impact in that, right? Because you had certain streaming companies, not all of them, certain streaming companies willing to pay a lot of the salary for players from Korea who would come over, because they figured that they would be internationally famous, that they would get a lot of hits. That didn't really pan out, so you had a lot less sponsorship money in the future years, and I think that that contributed to kind of the mass re-exodus and the return of players like Deft, Mata, Pawn, things like that, going it back and forming KT Rolster. But at the time, it was still very much player run, right? You still had the vibe that all of the teams in China were incredibly player run. You had players like Imp having a lot of say within LGD. You had players like this running the organizations rather than kind of the coaches or the staff, because obviously these are players who are either ex-world championships or on sister teams of ex-world champions who should know better than you, right? They've won worlds. Listen to them. That just contributed to sort of the player-run nature, the lack of infrastructure, more of the kind of wild, wild west idea of the LPL. So as we've seen in NA in recent years, a lot more money didn't necessarily translate to results. It didn't necessarily translate to infrastructure. It didn't necessarily translate to better teams. And we had probably the worst showing of the LPL in the history of the region in 2015, when only one of the teams got out of groups and they lost in quarterfinals. 2016, things were looking a little bit better, because you had Mata within Royal actively teaching a lot of the Chinese players, which I didn't think really happened before. There was a little bit of a segregation within a lot of the teams. Again, not all of them, a lot of them, between the Korean and Chinese players, and it was just a little bit solo queue in terms of how the teams operated. But in 2017, I would say this is really the turnaround and the start of the... Did I say 2016. In 2016, this was really the start of the turnaround, where you had players like Mata teaching more game sense to a lot of the teams. You had Edward Gaming entrenching sort of the information that they already know and integrating some of their players a little bit better. And you had just a general idea that macro was important too, right? It was really funny, because after the humiliating defeat in 2015, you had images on Weibo and everything else of these players suddenly learning Chinese. You know, suddenly the Korean players are going to learn really simple Chinese, and the photos of the Chinese they were learning were stuff that I learned basically within my first week of studying. So it was very bizarre in that sense, that you just had this impression that there was absolutely no like real sense of communication or team environment between the Korean and Chinese players on some of the teams before that. And in this time, I would say it's very easy to say that there was no real difference between NA, EU, and China. There was no really second best region, and I published a video for the Score Esports when I was working for them at the time at the end of 2016 saying there's no clear second best region. For a really long time I had argued that it was always the LPL, but because of the direction that they took, in a sense, that could no longer really be the case. But then you had something really interesting happen. You had ex-jungler, Joker, now caster coming out on stream and saying that a lot of the streaming companies were sort of pulling out of sponsoring some of these teams, that the money was drying up a bit to an extent where he thought that NA and Korea actually both had richer teams than the LPL. The point of this discussion is not to say that money is the root of all evil, but to say that the LPL had to go through a long and sort of arduous discovery to sort of realize and to sort of understand where some of their gaps were. They had always sort of had talented players. It was more that they were not kind of developing macro. They were not catching up in a sense that they really needed to get the consistency down pat. Not just the wild 1v1 outplays or the team fighting that a lot of these teams had. Obviously not all of them. But the general level of consistency, the deep understanding of the macro in the game. And even in 2015, when Edward Gaming won MSI, you had Chinese casters saying things like, well, SKT is the more interesting team to watch because their amount of strategy that they have and the macro that they can do is more involved and more developed. But Edward Gaming have more individually exciting players, so they're very fun to watch as well, and that's what that makes this matchup great. That's why when the RNG roster came out and I saw that you were bringing Let Me back, very strong synergy between the core players of Let Me, and like Shi and Xiaohu from before, you were bringing in Ming, who I looked up to a lot as a really strong support from the LSPL, the secondary league from Young Miracles that had failed to qualify many times for the LPL. I thought that this was a really good and really impressive start. That I projected this team would be first place in the LPL group, and a lot of people looked down on them just because of the lack of Korean imports, right? But then they developed over time. They nearly won the spring final, and then they came out and they nearly won the summer final, and they came out finally this year and they won the spring final, and they have not been able to stop winning since. You can also count All Stars if you want, just because it had members of RNG on it, notably UCI. We went on this mini LPL history lesson just to highlight that the consistency, even more so than the amount of wins, is what's impressive. The fact that they aren't dropping games to teams that are projected to be less than them. The fact that I still kind of hedged my bets and said that Edward Gaming might lose to Team Liquid in the first half or something along those lines. And then it came out that we're seeing a consistent identity to EDG. We're seeing a consistent identity to these teams. If they have certain conditions, they will win the game. That is something that you could never really say about the LPL before, at least not on the international stage. And that's why if you look at where the LPL were before, not just in 2015 and 2016, but in 2013, 2014, 2012, what they've accomplished now is just really ridiculous and worth screaming and swearing over. But that's exactly why the narrative in the West that we're just worse is so infuriating. It's so frustrating because you get the idea that, well, you know, the LCK teams have always been so far ahead in terms of esports infrastructure that it will take ages to catch up, that you can't really change the way that the infrastructure is developing, that the only reason China are doing well is because they have more money, they have more infrastructure, they have more talent. But the thing is that they have had so many excuses and so many reasons not to draw upon their own talent for so long that they have had this idea of loyalty, that players stay contracted for 3 years plus in this region for many reasons, so it's hard to amass all of the talent on to one team in the consistent manner. It's hard to constantly mine these solo queue environments for good players when organizations have constantly kind of looked abroad for them. Of course, you have on these teams really, really strong individual Korean players as well. You have on IG, you have Rookie, you have Duke, you have the Shy, but obviously these players are players who kind of stuck it out in the LPL. These are the players who stuck around. Rookie really took to the environment. He liked the idea of being able to be in LPL, someone who is sort of loved by fans more so than Kakao because he learned Chinese quickly and then he's always stayed devoted to the region. He's become a leader within his team. On Edward Gaming, their star Korean players are players that they invested in themselves, that they developed themselves. Ray started out, his very first team was the Edward Gaming Academy team. Scout was constantly on the bench for SKT, and Edward Gaming decided to invest in him themselves. And it took years and for him to iron out some of the kinks and his inconsistencies, and now he looks much more like a well-developed player. You have the individual Chinese players obviously consistently shining through. It doesn't feel like there's a hard carry sense. It's a much more integrated sense of teamwork on some of these teams. Then is the major takeaway. What is the lesson? You can have really good teams, right? Not all of the LPL teams are insanely high level. You can have a couple of really good teams with good talent on them, with a focus on developing teamwork and have them do very well. And that's kind of the bare bones of how do we get to that point, because it's easy to say that, but it's not about hiring the best Korean players. It's not about doing all this stuff. You can't make excuses like we'll never have good enough players. We'll never have good enough infrastructure, because I can guarantee you that China's journey was primarily about getting to the point of how do we identify our own talent? How do we funnel resources that we have into something efficient? What part of the chaff can we cut? What is overbloated? What is really necessary? And the conclusion they got to has way less to do with throwing $1 million into X player or X coach or any of these factors, and has way more to do in communication, something that RNG emphasized all of 2017 throughout the course of their development. In 2017, at the end of the year, you even had articles being published about how a lot of these teams were player run. If teams didn't want to feel like practicing, they didn't necessarily practice that much. So it wasn't that the infrastructure is so sick or so deep or so super intense that eventually led to the LPL turning around. And even if I'm understating the infrastructure criminally, there was a point very recently where it was not stellar, where it was even more player run than arguably either Europe or North America. And LPL was at that point. They were taking games off of NA and EU and having the vice versa happen to them. But they turned it around pretty quickly. They found ways to be strong. And even if you're looking at the LPL as North America or Europe and you're saying, well, they just have more players, that in and of itself is another excuse, right? There are always going to be advantages that teams can have. I would say that Europe has a huge identification system or focus on strong laning in some of their teams. It's something that they can draw on. You have North American teams that have thought a lot about infrastructure. They've been investing in infrastructure, and some of it is bad or some of it is not good, but there's a process of elimination that's going on and developing here, and they can eventually get to a point where they can succeed. And it's just this idea that you are given a set of skills and you cannot achieve, you're not thinking about the process of getting to an end point, is something that I've encountered a lot in particularly American culture, was that, there will always be someone better than you, and there's just not so much that you can do to overcome it. And the more time I've spent abroad, the more time I've sort of realized that that's not how most people think. And that's a disadvantage that you give yourself. And this is obviously pseudo-philosophical, and I don't know why every team is failing, I don't know why every team is succeeding, and I don't know where there is this factor or that factor or what the cultural implications are, but I do know that LPL came from here. EU and NA were also very much here. To an extent, LPL at a point was even lower, right? They were in an even lower point than NA and EU. Now they're here, okay? Now they're extremely high up. There's absolutely no excuse for still being here. All that fails, just look at the Flash Wolves. The LMS probably has the worst in terms of infrastructural, in terms of staff, in terms of domestic resources and talent. But Flash Wolves are constantly capable of reaching up to the top, of taking games off of the Korean powerhouses, of putting up a great fight against Europe, of putting up a great fight against North America, putting up a great fight against China. Just one team, just the Flash Wolves. They're making excuses for what they can or cannot do. And if you lump the achievements of Flash Wolves and the LPL in this year with, well, the East has always been ahead of the West, or, well, it was just kind of a fluke streak, And you're not only doing a disservice to the growth that the LPL has achieved over the course of several years, but to what the rest of us can achieve. So, thank you, LPL, for being this year's great inspiration so far, and I would be really excited if you managed to keep that up and make an even larger statement than you already have.